Hi, I'm your host, and this is segment or part 6 of our energy series. And in this segment, we're going to look at nuclear. Energy, of course, gets a lot of investment attention. It's been historically such a great source of returns. That hasn't always been true of late. Um, as we can note with renewables, and also the case when it comes to nuclear. It kinds of reminds me of venture capitalists saying they're going to give money to a startup web-based business, and Dilbert saying, what do you create besides accounting irregularities? And he says, well, that's all I have the energy for. Yes, energy, the master currency. So, what we end up seeing here with this Sprott headline is that we have a long veteran, very successful resource speculator who, uh, in very recent months, went from having a placing a bet of $1 billion to moving that bet up to over $13 billion, and that bet is on uranium. Well, what does Mr. Sprott know that maybe all of us want to know? Well, when we look at nuclear electricity production, we only have to look back to the 1970s to find that in relative history, it's a rather new phenomenon that is growing very rapidly um, in most timelines. And the U.S., France, China, and Russia have been far and away the largest nuclear users for producing electricity. Uh, Very interesting, of course. Um, and then what we see is that in terms of numbers of planned and proposed new nuclear plants, well, there's a lot on the books. Um, Asia, particularly China, has 56 planned, 220 more nuclear plants proposed. And so you get the picture. It looks like there will be an awful lot more nuclear used. When we look at materials that are required to build various alternative energy systems, what we end up maybe surprising people with the number is that tons per terawatt hour, um, solar PV uses the most tons of materials. Hydro second, of course, predominantly concrete. Um, when I look at, or when you look at embodied energy in cement and concrete and steel and glass, uh, very intense in terms of embodied energy. And so pretty interesting that nuclear is as low as it is on these numbers. So um, potentially exciting from these perspectives so far. And so now we look at, well, what is the source of nuclear energy? And of course, it's uranium. And we can see since 2020, and then what's projected is that we're going to use more and more tons of uranium. Makes sense. And where do we get this uranium from? Well, we 40% comes from Russia. 10% is US, 11% is Australia, Canada 20%, and then kind of spread out, if you will. So that's sources. There's a huge opportunity in nuclear. Well, there's several of them really. One is that currently by estimates we're only using about 1% of the embodied energy in uranium. Now, I'm not deeply technical in these matters, but my understanding is that the science just isn't there to know how to use more than that 1%, and then still control the process. It gets out of control on us if we try to go farther. So that's one opportunity. There's opportunity in nuclear that says, well, let's not use uranium. How about if we use thorium as an example, which is much, much more abundant? That hasn't been sorted through entirely. And so there's the old joke in uranium that the next advancement is always 10 years away. And of course, that'll be funny until one day that we actually break through these things. But in the meantime, we really have to deal with the numbers as they are today, not speculating when that next breakthrough will be. And we have to recognize that, some people try to just suggest that, hey, look, nuclear waste isn't an issue. Well, it is. We still don't really know what to do with it. It's small spatially in some ways, but shouldn't have to convince anybody how dangerous it is, and for a very long time. And so Chernobyl tells us, well, there's a whole bunch of land that is not inhabitable today. The Japanese Fukushima incident tells us they too don't really have land to have not uninhabitable. And really, really sadly, what we don't necessarily know is how damaging and for how long is Fukushima to the oceans of the world. And so as we see with this note on Madame Curie's notebooks, they're still too radioactive to be handled without protection, and they will continue to be on least until 3511. That does feel like a long time from now to me, for sure. And as compared to Chernobyl and Fukushima, those notebooks were exposed to virtually nothing in terms of radiation. In terms of uranium supply, it should really be noted in 2006 that the Energy Watch Group of Germany studied world uranium supplies, and they said in their most optimistic scenario, the peak of world uranium production will be achieved before 2040. And if large numbers of nuclear power plants are constructed to offset the use of coal as an electricity source, then supplies will peak much sooner. Well, the planned plants that we just showed you would suggest that, yes, indeed, like oil and gas and coal, uranium too faces a peak energy crisis. Today, they say there are 441 nuclear power plants operating in 30 countries. And this number of plants require 69,000 tons of uranium. In all, there are over 300 reactors being built, as you saw in the earlier slide. And so we need an enormous amount, 3 times more uranium, if we're going to fire up these plants. So, not commonly quoted, unfortunately. I think very well studied in the area. Dr. Helen Caldicott was bold enough, honest enough to put forward that if all the world's electricity was nuclear generated, of course, that's not going to happen, but if it was, the supply of accessible uranium would be exhausted in 9 years. So, all that is to say, um, with 300 more plants coming online, at least, it's not necessarily a long way away to exhaust the current uranium supply. Thorium might change that, being able to use more than 1% of the embodied potential of uranium, huge changes. Um, but as I say, they're not commercially operating yet. So in the meantime, what we end up looking at is the world might go increasingly nuclear, but every cubic mile of oil equivalent in a cubic mile of oil is energy used globally annually, will require 500 new surface uranium mines, 1,000 new underground uranium mines, and 2,280 nuclear reactor operations. So what we can see is that just replacing the energy that we're using with nuclear will require a whole bunch more energy, just because what it takes these days to mine uranium, in not very many places that we can mine uranium. Um, so it's a very good source of energy. It's somewhat tapped. It will play an ongoing role. Research is exciting. Um, Research on safety and waste management of nuclear is even more exciting in many ways. In our next segment, we'll spend some time on hydro.